What's up, guys? Today I have a crazy spot. Patrik Antonius, one of the all-time greats, Finnish legend. He has been put in a really tough spot in the 25k super high roller at Triton, Cyprus by Faridin Mustafov. Let's take a look at this crazy spot. We are 3 players left. It's Steve O'Dwyer, Faridin Mustafov, and Patrik Antonius. Mustafov is big chip leader with about 14 million, and Steve and Patrik are both a bit shorter. Blinds are 200k, 400k, and I think they both have around 15 big blinds. So chip leader on the button with around 35 bigs, and he can therefore put on quite some pressure. That's why we will also see the 10-8 offsuit open by Mustafov, which is fine.
It's a lot of chips, but with Antonius at one point had 14 million with many more people. He's not in a position.
So Mustafov open raises 10-8 offsuit for 800k. So min raise, that's also the strategy I would suggest here. Let's just take a really quick look at these spots, because when you're in the spot, it would be nice if you know what to do. Small blind and big blind can be reshoving quite some. So if we take a look at the chip leader on button, we want to be opening quite wide, but also don't go too crazy. So let's say instead of the normal range, we want to be putting in some of the closer hands. I would personally probably open around 65% in this particular spot, depending on how wide I think they're rejamming. So if I think they're a bit over the top, then it's more 60. And if I think they're too passive, then it can go as wide as 80, 85. And if they're just way too weak, then you can open any too profitable, but that's very dependent then also on opponents, on how much we want to be exploiting. So on the button, we're also going to have some open shoves. That's important. So all the medium equity type of hands we don't want to raise call with, but that are good enough in terms of equity against their calling ranges, those we want to go all in with. So lots of suited hands, basically all our suited middle, and then it's going to be a bit more polarized top and bottom. So some raise folding and some raise calling hands, and the raise folding hands come from the bottom of our range. That could be hands like 10-3, 10-4 suited, could be hands like King Deuce offsuit. Open shoves are more like Queen 6 suited, for example, is a very clear open shove for me here. 10-8 suited, stuff like that. So 10-8 off is on the cusp, where I would also, in this particular situation, prefer an open raise. It's quite close, so 10-9 off could go into the shoving range already, but 10-8 off, I think, yeah, does pretty well here as an open raise. So far, so good. Now we get to Patrik Antonius in the big blind with the Jack Deuce suited and around 15 bigs. And that's already quite close, I think, in this particular constellation. I think that is important also to really make those adjustments depending on ICM and the payouts. We don't want to be over defending too much here. I think Jack Deuce suited is basically right on the edge. If it's like 9 Deuce suited, I would suggest to fold. And then Jack 3, Jack 4, Jack Deuce suited is probably close, like 10-5 suited, 9-5 suited. Like these feel the borderline suited hands for me, and then probably the offsuit 8s and like King 7 off, and I would defend or rejam every offsuit ace. This type of range against opponents that I think are have a higher raise folding gap, so that maybe don't open jam enough and then raise fold a bit too much. Against those, I want to be rejamming more, especially with like my suited type of hands, so 10-9 suited, 10-8 suited, Queen 10 suited, all my ace X. This is very important that you integrate that. If you think they don't open jam, this is a pretty popular mistake. A good exploit to implement in your game to increase your win rate. Important note here is to not over defend, especially with the other short stack. There's just not a crazy amount to be gained here by defending too wide. So Jack Deuce suited on the cusp, I think EV runs close, but I would also defend it, and yeah, just make sure to not defend too wide here. Now let's get the party started. We get to a flop of 7 Deuce 6, Deuce 6 of clubs, 7 of hearts. Let's take a look at it from Antonius' perspective. He gets a pretty decent flop. We have a bottom pair and a backdoor flush draw. And Mustafov also has a pretty decent hand with 2 overcards and a gut shot. Also backdoor flush draw and backdoor flush draw blocker, which can also be a valuable thing, maybe later in the hand. That's interesting already. Now in terms of c-betting strategy, one interesting thing to note here is that's a pretty advanced concept. But if we, obviously in Patrik's shoes, we are almost only checking this flop, and Mustafov's open raising range actually includes quite some 6x and 7x, because that's an advanced concept. But if he open raises a bit more polarized, right, we jam the middle, the suited hands, and like some of the connected offsuit hands, what we would open raise is those 7x and 6x. Those hit us a little better, that actually is kind of a plus for his range. So because he doesn't have that middle range, doesn't have as many 2 overcard hands as in other types of scenarios. That's an interesting spot where he hits this board actually pretty decent, and he should be having a pretty high c-betting frequency here. So if I look at this particular board, I think that given the ICM pressure and his range composition, that he should be c-betting this board with a rather high frequency. I don't think it's 100%. I don't think your range supports that, but it can be, I think, somewhere between maybe 60 and 80%. So that short, that would be a rather high frequency. So I think if I would have to settle somewhere, I would probably think that I c-bet this flop 70-75% of the time. And a hand like 10-8 offsuit definitely works very well for this. Can also continue versus check raises. So this is generally a reason when we c-bet that often, that we want to continue, or that we want to be betting this hand on the flop. So 10-8 off here, I would be expecting a bet.
With the gut shot on 2 overs, Antonius bottom pair.
7.
And backdoor hearts connecting with this 7-6 deuce flop.
Mustafov goes for the around 30% bet, which I think is fine. I think also smaller works. Patrik has a lot of risk premium, so generally his equity hands, also the loose continues, struggle quite a lot already. So I think that there's probably a point to be made to have a very small c-betting range here as well. Like there's benefits for 20%, there's benefits for 30% for a particular hand range. So I think a hand like this doesn't necessarily need to size up too much. So I think anything between 500 and 700 is a decent c-bet size here. I do like the bet so far. And now with Patrik, we just have one choice. We never check raise this combo. It's just 100% call. Patrik makes the right choice, decides to call rather quickly. Now we get to the turn.
Turn. Queen of Hearts rolling off over card to the flop.
And the turn is the Queen of Hearts. Now that is a very interesting card. On the one hand, Mustafov's particular hand, 10-8 with both the 10 of hearts and the 8 of clubs, is a great bluff combo. So now with around 1.5 SPR, so stack to pot ratio, this hand functions pretty well as a bluff that he wants to continue almost all the time, especially with ICM pressure, which reduces the interest for Patrik to stack off lighter or get it in lighter. That increases the interest for Mustafov to put more chips in the middle and bluff him out, bluff him off equity, make him fold a deuce or a 6, or even a weak flush draw, stuff like that. And having quite some good equity that he is not going to be pushed of that often, because Patrik cannot just rip in a lot of hands. So a great spot for Mustafov. In terms of Antonius' spot, the queen is much better for Mustafov than for him, because he doesn't call that many queen X, and mostly it's just 2 pair hands and some flush draw queen X. The queen is much better for Mustafov, or quite some better, and so we will see basically I would expect 100% check here by Patrik and a pretty high betting frequency by Mustafov, and 10-8 with both the 8 clubs blocker and the 10 of hearts. I would put 100% in my betting range here. And now this is an interesting thing already, right? On this part, I think where a lot of strong players differentiate from weaker players is around sizing and identifying different categories of hands. So I think the first step for me that would be pretty important is that this is a pretty mandatory bluff, in my opinion, with the gut shots and the 2 overs to the 7 and the 2 blockers. So I would think if you have like 10-8, no blockers, I think that is kind of the needle mover to check this hand more often. But this particular combo, I consider 100% bet. And then if you bet, I think you generally want to attack just a hand like Jack Deuce of spades. With that sizing, I would think that around a 40 to 50% sizing would be the sizing that I would take. 40, 60, anything 60 or higher seems getting a bit too large. Here it's obviously really hard to differentiate. Like there could be some merits in a variety, but I think the part that we attack is not really in the high equity threshold, so we don't really try to attack very strong hands. We try to attack more the medium and weaker hands, and we're not pushing that much to just get all the chips in right now. So I don't really think that we will see all-ins here or something like that. So I think it's really going to be a lot of this around the half pot sizing. Let's see what Mustafov does.
1,400,000.
1.4. He's million. Antonius with a hand that can definitely check call again.
So Mustafov goes for the around 40% sizing, which I do like. I think it accomplishes that. I do think that there is already a little bit of a constellation where most players, I think, go a little bit bigger if they have a value hand here. Let's call it a bet sizing tell. I think that there's a lot of players that if they have, let's say, pocket tens or pocket jacks or kings, no club, no heart, that they choose a larger sizing. And that's not something that they balance. So it's really more if they have kings, no club, no heart, they bet 1.8 million. And if they have like 10-8 off, then they bet 1.4 million. That's something to keep in mind, that I think there's this subconscious thing happening that when they don't have a button to click like online, then they choose the sizing that feels a bit more intuitive. Like, oh, okay, I have a good hand that I want to protect and put more chips in against his draws, then I go a bit bigger. And if I have a hand that just wants to attack his weaker hands, then I choose a smaller sizing. So that is a pretty valuable thing to also look out for. If you see that in your opponents, you can take advantage of that. So now Patrik has a decision on the turn where he takes quite a long time. What he's thinking about is very clearly between call and jam. I think it's kind of a back and forth. I believe that in theory, that call is a slight to decent favorite. The EV will run pretty close, and I think fold is the only really bad option compared to the two options. So I would think that call is slightly better than all in, and both are quite much better than fold. So that's, I think, always important to establish, okay, like how are the options that I have ranked? Then you can start thinking about, okay, what would be necessary or what would need to happen to make it a good shove? And to make it a good shove, our opponent, so in this case, Mustafov, would need to have a weak betting range that has equity against our hand. So we would need to know that our shove goes through more often than we think. So if, for example, we have this read, okay, if he has a strong hand, he bets larger. And if he has a weak hand or a draw, he bets smaller. Then that would be a great read to think, okay, the EV of shove is higher here than of call. So I do that instead, which I think is fairly reasonable assumption. If I have a draw here against this particular sizing, which I think is slightly more on the edge of bluff than value, where I think anything above 1.5 is a bit more leaning towards value, and anything below between 1 and 1.5 is a bit more leaning towards bluff. Or queen jack of clubs, for example, that's also hands that would choose that sizing. So it's a kind of a semi-polarized type of approach to this bet sizing. But generally, I think we have a higher EV of jamming against this. Let's call it smaller sizing versus bigger sizing. The more often we have seen this from one opponent, the more confident. So there are some players where I have this type of read and then I make these type of adjustments. But in this case, I would just say, I don't know the player very much. I wouldn't read too much into it. I think it's not a particularly small sizing. Jack deuce of hearts for me, a pretty clear call on the turn. And now this is interesting to also think about, okay, why did Patrik take so much time, right? Like it needs to be this. He takes one or two timings, I think, and then calls. So definitely he had a decision on the turn. I think generally in those spots, it's never super fake. It's not like queen 6 and he super fakes. In this particular spot, it's more likely to be a decision. Could be a decision between fold and call, which I think is slightly less likely, or it could be a decision between jam and call. And then it's more likely to be a hand like this, which is an interesting spot to be in. So if Mustafov picks this up, also, again, interesting information and very hard to compute in 20, 30 seconds.
Ace of diamonds on the river.
But now the ace of diamonds on the river, and I want to expand a bit on this river card. We get there to the river, and it looks like a bad river. We don't hit a flush, we don't hit two pair, we just have fifth pair. Now let's take a look at the action.
Brick City for Patrik.
Can he barrel again with 10-8 high? It's unlikely for Antonius to hit the ace. A lot of these hands of ace could rejam pre-flop hypothetically.
All in.
All in with 10-8
Wow,
high.
gangster.
And Antonius has got bottom pair. Can he make the call?
Very, very important here. This is the golden nugget of this whole spot. Mustafov thinks for, I would estimate, around 10 seconds. He looks at the board, he's thinking, and then around 10 seconds, and he goes all in. Obviously, this is a really tough spot, but I want to make a case for it being a very clear spot. And the reason why I think it is a very clear spot is the construction of the range and what we get there. So what does he play in this way? And then how do we end up, or with which type of hands do we end up on the river? I want to make a case for this being a snap. decision. If we went through the entire hand, right? So he bets 30% on the flop, then he bets 40% on the flop, and now he goes all in for, I think that's about 3.5 into 6.4. So let's say a bit over half pot left. What is very important, the first thing that comes to mind is very easy to just think about, okay, what are the odds we're getting, right? We only have to call 3.5 to then win what's in the pot plus 3.5. So around 10 million. So the odds we're getting are pretty damn good. So that's the first important thing to note, right? We don't have to be right that often. Adding into this is ICM matters. So we should be not break even. If we think we only right 30% of the time, that's not a good call. We want to be right here 40-50% of the time or something like that. That would be a great outcome, maybe even more often. And now I want to make a case for this being a great spot to be in, because now the next step that I go through is I try to think about his value hands. What are Mustafov's value hands? Could be a river ace. But then if we think about it, there are not that many river aces. He could take this line with an ace king or an ace jack. He could bet ace jack on the turn again. He could bet a hand like ace 10 on the turn again. I'm not a huge fan of it, but it's possible, right? It's definitely not bad. I would not say that's a bad choice. I think that is a pretty reasonable line to take, but I wouldn't expect it to happen 100%. So that's something we would need to calculate with on the river. He could have ace king. He could have ace king and ace jack type of hands. Next hand category is he could have very strong hands, right? He could have a hand like ace queen. He could have a hand like pocket sixes. He could have a hand like pocket sevens. He could have a hand like 6-7 suited, stuff like that, right? So there's only a few combos of very strong hands. That is, I think, an important one also to think about. Pocket sixes, he might open jam preflop. He might not raise call. Pocket deuces, he will definitely open jam preflop. Pocket sixes or pocket sevens, I don't know his style very well. He should probably be just raise calling them. He might though. He might open jam. So that's one thing to think about. So in the very strong hand category, there's not that much. There are only a few combos in the very strong hand category. Now in the, let's say, top range of ace king type of hands, we know, we have talked about those, so they exist. We get into the value shoves, and that is the interesting thing now. If we go further, he should have a lot of value shoves that now, and this is where my hypothesis comes, I don't think he has. Hands like king queen, hands like queen jack, maybe even a hand like king 7, pocket 8s, pocket 9s. Those hands against the hand of Patrik Antonius, he has very little queen x. He has pretty little ace x. A lot of his ace x should be shoving pre. There is not very much ace x, not very much queen x. So basically, he would need to go, or he should be going pretty wide for value. Like for chip EV, very clear. ICM obviously makes it a bit more tricky, but I would still make the point that pocket 10s or whatever, pocket 9s is a pretty clear value shove here on the river against how I think his range looks. So I would be pretty comfortable putting in the chips there against what I think Patrik range looked like. I don't think he has almost any ace x pre-flop. I think he shoves maybe too many. You could say too many. But I think he shoves a lot of ace x pre. And I think he has barely any queen x that he calls on flop and then doesn't check shove on turn. So I don't think there's very many queen x. So I feel very comfortable with a hand like pocket 9s. It seems like, oh, it's only third pair or whatever, or third possible pair. Still, I feel pretty confident with that. I don't think, I would discount this almost entirely. I don't think Mustafov goes thin enough for value in only 10 seconds. I also don't think I would do it. I wouldn't shove 9s like in 8-second tank. Just think about it, look at it like, okay, clear. I would think a little bit about it. So that's why in those spots, I also take my 25 seconds with bluffs and with strong hands, because I know there's going to be some tricky situations there. This is the most important thing about this spot, in my opinion. And why I think this is a pretty clear call here is because of the following reason. Very, very small, super strong hands. Not that many hands that he bets through that get there on the river. A few ace king, ace jack type of hands. Ace 5 or whatever he might blast through. Totally reasonable. Can happen. But not that many combos. Now, we only need to find an equivalent of bluffs that makes this a reasonable hand for us. And this is where I think we will find plenty of bluffs. I think there will be a lot of hands that just feel, somewhat natural for him to go and bet and continue betting. This could be just all types of equity hands. This could be missed flush draws. This could be a hand like 4-5 suited. Could be a hand like 10-8 off. Could be 9-10 off that he's not shoving pre. Could be even just a hand like whatever, king 8. Yeah, just a random hand that he bets. Could be a hand like whatever, Jack 5 of clubs or something like this that he bets again. So I think there's a lot of hands that he can find to bluff, and I don't think he's aware that he's not going thin enough for value. So I think he will just have a particular bluff on the river and go for it. So my conclusion in this particular spot is the 10-8 off that he has to go in there. Definitely a hand he has to bluff. I don't blame him for it. I would also shove it on the river. But I also think people don't go thin enough for value here on the river. So the Jack deuce, in my opinion, is a very impressive but very clear call. Yeah, let's take a look at what Patrik does and let's see if he can find it. Patrik takes, I think, all his time banks, 4 or 5 time banks, sitting there and tanking, and he makes the call, finds it, and insane. So Patrik Antonius, I've seen him more and more now playing at Triton and sometimes chatting with him, and he just has such a nice demeanor. I really like just his style of playing. So very, very nice find. And I think dissecting this type of hand, I found this one really interesting because it's so hard to come up with this stuff in there. Like 30 seconds, you have 1 minute, like, and then figure all this out. Like think about his pre-flop range, his flop betting range, his turn betting range, his river bluffing range, and then figuring out what type of hands you want to be calling against this. I really like that he came to the conclusion to call here. I think this was an insane hand, basically for the win. Patrik ended up winning this tournament, the 25K super high roller. Well done. Insane hand for 13 million pot. Those are the dream spots to be in, to be right in a spot like this. I hope you like this type of analysis and dissection. I'm going to be making and putting out more hands like this, sharing my thought process on the different streets, reviewing some of the sickest hands in the high roller scene played by some of the best in the world. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to support the channel and stay always up to date, then leave a subscribe here or check out our next video.